So let's get to the topic. Looking deeply. Um, I already gave you just a little bit of a taste tonight in guiding the meditation. Um, so oftentimes people come to meditation because they are stressed and they want to relax. And of course, relaxation and calm are really important things in meditation to be able to access. Um, and they're really valuable. To calm the body is helpful for the body, it's helpful for the mind. And to develop some concentration, some ability for the mind to stay put on something is really helpful for a variety of activities in life. But this is a class that takes it one step further. In the Buddhist teaching, it's, one develops calm and concentration really as a preliminary step. It's not considered the end goal of meditation is to be calm all the time or to have the mind be so laser focused that you can concentrate on anything. Um, those are the means to really seeing deeply and coming to understand your experience and the nature of your experience in a way that is liberating, is actually freeing. Because when we don't see our experience clearly, if we don't see deeply enough into the nature of this human experience, then we often are, living in ways that are unskillful. So there's a story in my family that I like to think about where I don't remember what age I was. I might have been 12. And we were traveling as a family in the car and visiting people that my parents knew who were in the western part of the state of Washington when I grew up. And then we knew some people in Oregon. And so typically my father would be driving and my mother would be in charge of navigating when we got to the city. That was in the good old days, before there was GPS and you could just plug an address into your phone and some electronic voice would tell you how to get somewhere. You actually had to read a map and you actually got lost a lot more frequently, to tell you the truth. So we were driving through Portland and we kept getting lost and my father was getting frustrated. And so then my mother mentioned Aurora Avenue and suddenly the light went on in my father's head. He said, "What map are you using?" And it turns out she was using a Seattle map to try to navigate us through Portland, Oregon. And so no wonder it was all going wrong. And fortunately, she named a major street in Seattle that everybody who's ever lived in Seattle or been to Seattle runs across, Aurora Avenue. So suddenly it could be recognized. We are not using the right map. So I think this is a great metaphor for what spiritual practice is and can be for us, is that we've got reality mapped out wrong in many cases. In most cases, there's some deep flaws in our maps. There are places that exist that aren't on our maps, but there are places that exist on our maps that we think we know what the territory is like, and it's actually not that way at all. And there can be some pretty basic errors. Now, one of the dangers, I think, of contemporary Buddhism, particularly Buddhism in the West, is there are a lot of books. You can read books about Buddhism. You can learn the Dharma kind of intellectually. You can hear it and just take it in conceptually. But none of that is actually going to help you when it comes to a map because, the intellectual map is one thing. And so you can hear teachings about the nature of reality as being impermanent and without self, and hear about suffering and how not to suffer. But it doesn't actually penetrate very deeply unless you actually notice the teaching as it is in your moment-to-moment experience. It's so important that you actually practice. And by that I mean that you bring attention to your experience as it's happening. That's the essence of mindfulness, is bringing attention to experience as it's happening. It's what we did in the meditation tonight. And so yes, there's relaxation there. When you notice the breath, you would go through the body, you do the body scan. Things relax. They mostly relax, I think, because you free the mind from judgment for a while, and suddenly it settles down. You free it from thinking for a while, and it settles down. So yeah, there's a lot of settling, there's a lot of calming. But it's also really helpful when you start to see deeply what's true. So to give you an example of just a very, very common thing, I mentioned this in the meditation, but I'll mention it once again. You know, the instructions are to stay with the breath. And if the mind wanders off, to come back. Okay, fairly simple. But what actually happens inside of people who are new to meditation, and even some who are at it for quite a while, is that there's the belief that they just have to try hard enough to get the mind to stay on the breath. You know, if you just cinch down enough, that you're going to be able to do that. So there's this control thing, and there's this sense of a controller inside who's been told to do something with his or her experience. And so the controller gets activated and says, okay, I'm going to produce this result that you're supposed to do in meditation. I'm going to make the mind stay on the sensations of the face. And then it doesn't happen. And then you notice, you know, at some point things kind of wander off. And if you don't actually see the nature of your experience deeply, you may have the belief that you did something wrong there. In other words, you see that as being about you in some way, rather than just being about, well, this is what happens. Thoughts happen. I've often thought that would make a great bumper sticker. You know, thoughts happen. Because they do. They just arise. And it's really helpful to notice that, not just once. Because it's sort of like, oh yeah, Mark, I know that. I've got that. No, you don't. No, you don't. It's really important to go deeper with it, to really see the way that the things that arise in the mind arise of their own. They arise of their own through the forces of causes and conditions. And there is a margin of choice there, but it's not kind of the absolute dictator of the self that we tend to think is in play here, that you should be able to make whatever you're supposed to have happen. It just doesn't work that way. We're working skillfully with the mind, and the first thing we run up against is, oh, this mind, it's not very controllable. There's a margin of choice. We set an intention, and it definitely changes something. When, say, we intend to focus on breathing, that intention, it does something. We're much more likely to remember that, oh, breathing, oh right, we're supposed to breathe. It's a little easier in class because I'm talking, and so my voice interrupts you and keeps you on task. When you meditate not in class, you may find it's quite different. You may find that the mind wanders much more freely because there's nobody chiming in, which could be a reason, especially if you're a beginner, to meditate to me giving instructions, which you can do by listening to the recorded meditation. There are also some recorded meditations at the Bodhisara website, which is bodhisara.org. That's BODHISARA. I think if you just Google Mark Hart meditation, it might come up anyway. So I do recommend that, especially if you're new to the practice or you're getting back into it. Maybe you've been meditating for years, but you've kind of gotten out of it. It can be helpful to have somebody kind of interrupting you. But then it's also helpful, if you're in the habit of always listening to something like that, to turn it off. It's humbling. because then you're really getting the schemes of recurrence of your own mind without somebody else interrupting it. And so it's easier to get lost. It's easier to go off thinking about something. I notice when I teach, I have some of the clearest meditations when I teach. The mind doesn't wander hardly at all. It has something to do with being on, when you got this live mic and you've got, 25 people listening to you. Something shifts and there's a strong intention, a strong resolution to not start thinking about something. So I have very clear meditations. But you set me down on the cushion when I'm not in front of 25 people. And similar to other human beings, the things that have some energy around it to think about them, they come up and they catch me and they can hold on for a while before I even notice that they're there. So that's an example of what I mean by seeing deeply. Actually being awake in your experience to what happens and what brings about suffering. What causes suffering to arise in your experience. So we can use the meditation for that as a kind of a laboratory where we can shine a lens, like a microscope, on our experience to see, like, what is suffering. Another thing that I mentioned in meditation, so it's really common for aversion to come up when you're meditating. Aversion is that feeling of not liking the experience. It can come up in a lot of forms, like wanting the meditation to end, or maybe you feel aversion to me, to how often I say something in the meditation. If you're used to meditating quietly, it's sort of like, when is he going to give us any quiet? Believe me, I'll get a little more quiet as the class goes on. I talked a lot tonight, but that's aversion, that sort of like that ick feeling, that yuck feeling, which is like, like you want to get away from something. That's the essence of aversion, is you want to get away from something that's present. So it's really important when aversion arises to see it as what it is. This is aversion. And aversion is a mental state that arises. It arises on its own. It arises due to causes and conditions. So something causes it to arise in your meditation. And so the first step is to just notice that it's there. And maybe the next step, I think, to see it a little more deeply is to see it as suffering. I have a little phrase that I teach people over and over to use. It comes directly from the Buddha Suttas. It comes from, instruction, and you read it over and over. This is suffering. Idam dukkam. This is suffering. And so it's just a pure recognition of, this doesn't feel good. Aversion just of itself doesn't feel good. When you don't like the tone of my voice or how much I'm talking, when you feel uncomfortable sitting, or when the mind gets bored or wanders, wants to think about something more interesting than the breath, all of those things, all of that kind of turning away, which is literally what the word means in Latin, aversio, turning away, turning away from what is, there's the feeling tone of suffering. There's an unpleasant feeling tone. So for this first class, I just want to introduce really one of the most basic distinctions from the Buddha's teaching, but it's the one that will take you really almost the whole way. So valuable. And that's the distinction between wholesome and unwholesome when it comes to states of mind. Certain states of mind are wholesome, certain states of mind are unwholesome. What does unwholesome mean? Unwholesome means, quite simply, if you feel them, if you actually feel the feeling of the mental state, there's suffering in it. If you feel the feeling of certain mental states, there's no suffering in them. There's happiness in them, you could say. So aversion is a great example. When you're bored, it hurts. I don't know if hurts is the right word in English, because often what hurts means something more intense or more like, we would use the word pain with. It's painful to be bored? Well, kind of. It's a milder form of pain. It's a milder form of suffering. And so just notice it when it arises. Oh, this is boredom. And notice that feeling tone. That's where the rubber really meets the road. That's where true insight develops in meditation. It doesn't come from the conceptual understanding that aversion hurts. That's good enough. I mean, it's helpful to have that intellectual understanding. Just to know the Dharma in a kind of intellectual way, it's useful. But it's not what liberates. It's not really why we're here. But in that moment of actual experience where a state of mind arises, like boredom, for using that example, and you notice that there's an unpleasant feeling tone to the state that you're in, that's great. That's golden. Just to know the unpleasant feeling tone that is. We'll talk more about this because there's a whole kind of process to it, and I don't want to overwhelm you in the beginning. I want to stick with real basics, and it's a paradox because I think sticking to the basics will actually allow you to see more deeply into your experience than going off into much more kind of intellectually challenging notions. Although we will talk about the teaching of not self, which is quite challenging to people intellectually, and it's actually better if you stay away from it intellectually completely and stick to the direct experience where you can actually see it. But some other things, this idea of wholesome and unwholesome states is quite basic conceptually, but it's quite profound experientially. So you might also notice, just to talk about a wholesome state, for instance, the state of gratitude that arises. A number of people in checking in, saying their name and checking into the class express gratitude to me. And of course that feels good to hear. But more importantly, whether you noticed or not, it actually feels good to feel it in the mind that's grateful. The mind that's grateful is actually feeling a wholesome feeling tone in that moment. Gratitude is a form of happiness. It's actually a profound form of happiness as it deepens and develops. So for this first week, your instruction is to notice states of mind and notice their wholesomeness and unwholesomeness in their feeling tone. You could look up, I'm sure you could all Google, and if you want to, go ahead. I even thought of doing it for the class. Google list of wholesome and unwholesome mind states according to Buddhist psychology. They'll come up, they'll come up. I somehow remember, there's a number like 18 of the positive ones in the Abhidharma, and there's 30 some of the unwholesome ones. I could be wrong. It's been years since I learned it kind of on that level. And that could be, helpful just for pointing all the different possible mind states you could notice out to you to Google all the list. But what's actually more important is that you notice the ones that you're actually in. Notice the states that you're actually in. So I'll mention another aversive state which happens frequently, which is judgment. Okay? That judgment arises in the mind. And I might make it clear that for me there's really two different states that look a lot alike, but they feel entirely different. Discernment and judgment. And I'm using the word in judgment very specifically here in English. The word in English really could be a synonym for discernment. So I'm being a little bit, particular in the way I'm using these words. But for instance, let's say you're in a group of people and you notice that somebody is like talking all the time and not letting anybody else say anything and talking about themselves. And you can discern, okay, that's not skillful. This person isn't tuning in to other people in the group. But the feeling tone of that is not judgment, because there's no suffering. You're just like seeing things as they are. There's just a discernment. This isn't helpful. This isn't skillful. And that's in contrast to the kind of this person's talking all the time. They're not letting me, they're dominating the conversation. There's condemnation there. There's tightness. There's aversion. There's turning away from it. Like, I don't want this, and pushing it away. And there's suffering there. Doesn't matter if the judgment is valid or not. If there's aversion with it, who's suffering? This person right here is suffering with the aversion. So that's another example of just knowing the state that you're in. And I might as well mention another state while I'm at it. So many judgments go through our mind that we don't even notice them. We don't even notice that we're in a state of judgment when we are. That's called delusion, to name another state, that they come up together. So you're not only aversive, but you're deluded about it. You don't really even see that that's the state that you're in. You think that you're just seeing things clearly, and everybody would be angry at this person for what they're doing, that sort of thing. So that's your task, is to begin, and this is a lifetime work. This is not even a 1 8-week course worth of work to begin to notice wholesome and unwholesome. But what I think you can do, just applying yourself in this first week, is you can begin to get a sense of the different felt tone of the mind when it's in a wholesome state and when it's not in a wholesome state. You may not map out all the potential states. We're not doing Dharma here. We're not doing Buddhist psychology in that sort of way. We're just edging into what is it to actually see clearly what the feeling tone of the mind is. And maybe it's not so clear. Maybe it's not so clear. And then that's something to notice. There's a lack of clarity as to what the felt tone is. And it can be subtle. Sometimes I notice a subtle kind of shutdown state. Just a little bit numb. I have to say, it can come very easily from spending too much time on Zoom or spending too much time on the computer, really. But so sometimes the states are quite subtle, and you can say to yourself, I'm happy, I'm fine. Fine is a really unhelpful term. We use it all the time in social kinds of interactions. It's sort of a way to acknowledge somebody asked you how you are, and you don't give them a lot of detail. You just say you're fine. I'm not dying at the moment, so I can say I'm fine. But we actually don't spend much time just noticing what is the state we're in and naming it and knowing if it's wholesome or unwholesome, knowing if there's suffering in it or not suffering in it. When you're doing this exercise, beware of the thought or the belief that you should be always having wholesome thoughts and never having unwholesome thoughts. You set up a kind of suffering for yourself that way. You set up this comparing mind that's constantly comparing you to an ideal, which is actually quite unreachable. And you're going to get discouraged, which is another unwholesome state. And the reason, and here's the causation of it, is if you go into this mindfulness exercise with the belief that you're supposed to be able to control your mind well, to be a good meditator, a good Buddhist, and you're supposed to only have wholesome thoughts, wholesome states, even if that's unconscious. I mean, it sounds a little silly when I say it this way, but it's really possible that you could have this somewhat unconsciously, this sense that you're supposed to do it right all the time. And that sense of I'm supposed to do it right all the time starts to interfere and leads to discouragement. So we'll start simple, and this is hard enough, is to notice your states as you go through your day. It will help if you meditate every morning. So I really encourage you to have a daily meditation practice. Something about sitting down and being, calming the body and being with the breath and being mindful in that way, and even starting the laboratory of noticing your states when you're meditating. Starting in that laboratory, you start to carry it into your day. And it's hard once you get into your day. I know it's hard. All sorts of things are being thrown at you at work. You're constantly, your attention is called here, there, and everywhere. So it can be hard to notice your state. Once in a while, a state will clunk you over the head. It's so strong and so difficult. But for the most part, it's hard to give much attention to our states. But it's very useful. And if you sit every day, if you do the meditation, it carries over into your day, and you start to notice your experience. So I'm going to stop here. I think I've given enough content for now, and we're going to come back and let you talk a bit here.